My name is Joy Mayer, and I'm the director of a project called Trusting News. Since 2016, we have been studying how people decide what news to trust and standing in the gap of trust between the public and newsrooms, helping them understand each other. My colleagues Molly Muchna and Lynn Walsh are here, and they'll be moderating the chat. And feel free to ask them any questions that come up along the way. The structure for today is that I will talk to our super smart guest here for about 40 minutes, and then we'll take your questions as well. So do make note of things you'd like to hear more about as we go. I'm thrilled to introduce Dr. Benjamin Toff. Ben and I have been kind of informally collaborating for a few years now. He worked on the Reuters Trust in News project that just wrapped up, and a piece of that work has been studying people's relationship to news overall, and more specifically, the reasons that people do and do not engage with news. So I'm thrilled to have Ben here with us. There's just a ton of overlap between what he's been learning and what we do at Trusting News. So that is what we are going to explore today. Ben, hello, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Can you just orient us a little bit about where this book came from and the research you've been doing?
Yeah, so this research on news avoidance specifically kind of predated the work I was doing on the Trust in News project. All the way back in 2016, I had started working on that subject at the Reuters Institute as a postdoctoral fellow. We had the Reuters Institute does this large survey of news audiences around the world every year, the Digital News Report, which some of you may be familiar with. And at the time, they had a small segment of that survey sample they would screen out every year who said they consume news less often than once a month or never. And they didn't really know anything about that population because most of the survey wasn't relevant to that group, so they didn't include them. And so they had some funding to hire me to come try to explore that subject and better understand it. In the years since then, the COVID-19 pandemic happened, the sort of growing recognition that this was a sort of increasing problem, that more and more people were a problem, I should say, from the news organization perspective, maybe not so much from the public's perspective, but that the sort of awareness of this issue really, really took off. And so we tried to wrap up the project roughly in 2020 as the world was shutting down. We had finished a series of interviews and some surveys that we had conducted across the UK, the US, and Spain, which are the three countries that we focus on in the book. And we got the book together just as I was also starting to study this sort of larger topic of trust in news back at the Reuters Institute over the last 3 years. And so there's been a kind of alignment in terms of the overlap between these two subjects, trust in news and news avoidance, but they are closely related, and I think a lot of that work really also informed the trust in news research I was doing, and we can talk more about that as well. But that's a little bit of the background. The book finally came out the end of December, just a few months ago.
Well, I really highly recommend the book. It is, I'm a nerd who reads journalism research more often than most, but this does not read like an overly wonky research book. It's really approachable and practical. Can you ground us in some literacy around what we mean by news avoiders? What is that?
Yeah.
You mentioned people who consume the news less than once a month or never. Is that what we're talking about?
I mean, that's a big focus. We make a distinction in the book between what we call consistent news avoidance and selective news avoidance. The consistent news avoiders are those people who consume almost no news whatsoever. Less than once a month or never is the kind of arbitrary cutoff we use. But basically, it's people for whom news is largely not a part of their lives at all. And one of the reasons we were doing in-depth interviews with people because we recognize that like what people have in mind when it comes to news is going to vary a lot, and so there's only so much you could really learn from surveys when people have maybe have different things in mind in terms of news on social media or news that they're getting sort of secondhand through conversation. So we really want to understand from people's own perspectives what this meant to them, and what was driving some of those behaviors. So that's consistent news avoidance. We think it's probably the most concerning because there's a lot of research that shows how much engaging with news is related to people's ability to engage in political and civic life. And so we do think, there are some real, problematic aspects of that level of disengagement from news from the perspective of the people who are engaging that way. There is this other category of selective news avoidance, which is much, much more common. And the Reuters Institute has also asked on surveys how often you find yourself actively avoiding news, just one of the ways that that's often measured. And a lot of people actually feel that way. And the percentage of people who say that that's sort of describes their own experiences is growing. Just in the last 6 or 7 years, we've seen measurable increases in that percentage in a lot of different countries. In some countries like Brazil and the UK, that percentage has actually doubled. On average, it's about roughly 40% or so of the public looking across markets around the world. But you can ask the question different ways. Like Pew has asked about whether people feel overwhelmed by the amount of information they're experiencing. So like sort of more news fatigue, and sometimes those percentages are like 80%. And so the experience of feeling like you're sort of actively needing to avoid news and information is, I think, something that a lot of people can relate to. Whether or not you go as far as consuming almost no news is where that distinction between consistent versus selective news avoidance comes in.
When you look at both sides of the relationship, I mean, do you ever feel overwhelmed by the amount of news or the tone of the news you're consuming? I mean, I for sure do, right? Some news avoidance or some news fatigue is really understandable. Selective news avoidance, I think a lot of journalists would do well to more often kind of step back from the news and take some breaks from it, right? So I just want to make sure we have nuance as we approach this, that one of the problems at the heart of it, I think, is that journalist success metrics very often depend on getting people to consume more and more and more of something that might not actually be the healthiest relationship people can have to information. Of course, there are problems caused when people tune out from the news. So can we just talk for a second, and then we'll get into some themes in the book about like why it's bad that people tune out from the news, and why that's bad for society and why it's bad for journalism?
Yeah, and I think it's a really important point too. I think one of the things that's driving a lot of interest in the subject among news organizations is they're seeing in their own metrics declining interest and engagement. Some of that's driven by what's happening on digital platforms. Some of it is what's happening in the world, that a lot of people are feeling this way. But a lot of that, I think, is healthy. It's not actually just because you can consume news every waking hour of every day, it doesn't mean that one should. And most people don't really want that experience. And so I think there is a kind of shift that's needed around thinking about what is a sort of healthy relationship with news, and how can news organizations better serve the public in terms of what they're actually looking for, not just finding ways to get them to sort of pay attention to them constantly in a sustained way over time. But we do think, it is concerning the set of people who have kind of tuned out news altogether or never developed the habit at all, which is both of those things are going on among this consistent news avoider population. And it is concerning. They will tell us, they tend not to be people who are politically engaged at all. They have a hard time feeling like they have the ability to participate in political life because they don't feel like they know where to turn for information. They don't know how to make sense of information when they do go looking for it. Some of the interviews we were doing in the U.S., they were in Iowa, and we had people who were, I talked to a woman who actually wanted to go turn out to the Iowa caucuses, but she didn't understand what kind of time commitment was involved, and she had young kids that she had brought with her. She thought she could just like show up to vote, and was turned away when she realized she'd have to be there for a couple of hours. And sort of basic understanding of how to engage in political life, that if you don't have a sort of regular habit of paying attention to news, it can feel really overwhelming and difficult to engage with. And I think that's partly because it's the set of people who are likely to be in this population are already tend to be somewhat more disadvantaged, lower socioeconomic status. They tend to be younger people. Women are slightly more likely to be in this category of news avoiders. That has real impacts in terms of who is engaging in political life, and then who our politicians and who our political elites are catering to as a result.
Yeah, that news addicted personality, right? That's who journalists often cater to, and we'll talk more about that. And that's who public life is sort of catered to as well. Like if you're already engaged, we are here for you. But if you have not been tuned in, not been paying attention, it's just really hard to find your on ramp.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's talk about some themes from the book about what people say about their experience with news. And I would love to kick off with the idea that news is kind of hard to understand or hard to follow. And I wonder if you could, you know how much I love the Game of Thrones analogy used in the book. I wonder if you could kick off with that.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about, it's actually kind of an updated version of an old Lippmann analogy about like, what happens if you enter a play like in the middle of the second act and you don't know any of the characters, you don't know any of the plot that preceded it, try to make sense of what you're seeing. Most of that is just going to be meaningless and really hard to engage with. And so the Game of Thrones analogy, if you started tuning in season 4 and tried to make sense of who any of these characters were, or any of these plot lines, you'd have no idea, and the show would be completely, beyond anything you'd have any interest in. And I think there's a lot of that goes on with news, where most of particularly political news, there's so much of that substance that are these sort of ongoing storylines that are referencing people and events and issues that you really need a kind of store of knowledge about, that you have to have been paying attention to make sense of. I talked to somebody who said very explicitly, she said she hadn't been paying attention for news for years now, so she felt like she would need to spend so much of her time just trying to get back up to speed to be able to make sense of it. It just felt like it was easier to just tune it all out. And I think that's a common experience that people have, particularly with complicated political issues that are really dominant in the news. When we were doing the interviews in the UK, it was in the midst of just the aftermath of the Brexit vote, and it's a really complicated subject that people were trying to grapple with, that even the political leaders who were talking about it were having a hard time explaining, because no one quite knew what the consequences would be. And it was very abstract, and it had real impacts on people's lives, but in a way that was disconnected from the things that they cared most about, things that were close to home. And that's a real challenge. And a lot of the news about the subject wasn't really aimed at helping that set of the public make sense of it.
Yeah. I mean, I think you could use a sports analogy too, right? Like tuning into a football game story. If you don't know why anybody cares about which players, or why people are mad at the coach, or why it's a big deal that somebody got injured, there's just so much context that's needed. We'll talk more in a few minutes about what we can do about that. But I do want to acknowledge that it's complicated for journalists to figure out who they're trying to reach, because if you're covering the drama with this Speaker of the House vote, like, you both have an audience that wants to know what just happened and how many rounds of voting they've tried to have today. And you have a much bigger audience, I would argue, potential audience, that has no idea who the Speaker of the House is or what's even going on. So it's complicated to try to figure out how to serve both.
Yeah, and if you think about the sports analogy too, I mean, many of the news avoiders were not only just disconnected from politics, disengaged from politics, they didn't even necessarily knew how to place themselves on the political spectrum. They didn't necessarily have an attachment to any political party. So they also didn't have any feel of like they had any stakes in these partisan battles that are, arguably very consequential, very meaningful. But if you don't actually feel like you know where you fit in, what your team is, so to speak, like those incremental stories about Congress debating even really important things like impeachment. It's hard for people to engage with on that level if they're not already kind of on one side, and that's a lot of what's driving interest in political news, is definitely people who are partisan, who feel a sense of the stakes in a way that I think much of the rest of the public, who are pretty uninterested in politics and and increasingly want less and less to do with it, are having a harder time kind of seeing the value of that kind of news.
And a lot of people use that kind of partisan lens to make sense of what's happening in the news. And your book was talking about how a lot of people, when you ask them about news, went straight to political news. Like, there's hardly even just the assumption that if we're talking about news, what we mean is politics, specifically national politics. That's interesting for journalists to know, I think.
Yeah, exactly. I think a lot of people's sort of sense of what news is was so intertwined with their sense of what politics is, in a way that they didn't necessarily see journalists as being kind of watchdogs of our political leaders and our political system. They saw them as part of the same sort of inside club that really was sort of on the other side from the public. And I think that's part of what's driving this as well.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about the idea that that you write about that sort of news and maybe also civic life just aren't for people like me. That's aimed at somebody else. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, so this is where, particularly thinking about the consistent news avoiders who tended to be, less educated, less engaged in political life in general, they tended to also be embedded in communities in which they didn't know a lot of other people who talked a lot about news, focused a lot on news, or if they did, they sort of didn't see it as part of their own identities. They didn't have the kind of reinforcing social benefits from paying attention to news that when we talk to a sort of complementary group of what we call news lovers, which probably includes a lot of journalists who are in that category. Like it's hard to even imagine our social ties, our social communities, where news isn't a big part of what we talk about with each other. But for a lot of the news avoiders, it was a kind of foreign concept to think about like why you would do that. And without that kind of what we call the news communities, without being kind of embedded in those kinds of groups, it's very hard for people to see why any of it really is that relevant to them or has that much benefit to them. And we talk more about some of the very clear costs that people felt from, not just in terms of like how hard it is to understand, but how it made them feel and how depressing and upsetting and anxiety filling it could be. All of that just weighs on people, and that's not something that even people who love news will resonate with them. But if you don't have some kind of social reinforcement around the idea that it's that you're going to get something of value, it's very hard for that calculus to make any sense. And so when we ask people specifically about like, do you feel like it's an important civic duty to pay attention to news? Many news avoiders, they had some ambivalence about it. Some people felt like, maybe I should be paying more attention. But there were quite a lot of them who said like, no, I don't really think that being a good citizen is tied to, keeping up on the news. I think it's more important to, help out your neighbors and be a good member of your local community. That's what makes you a good citizen, not like whether you can parrot the latest talking points that you heard on MSNBC. And I think they have a good point. Like we often conflate knowing a lot about the sort of ins and outs of whatever the political stories are with the good citizenship in a way that I'm not sure that those two things are as aligned as we sometimes tell ourselves they are.
Yeah, you have it. One of the people you interviewed talked about how being a good citizen for him might mean pulling his neighbor's weeds, right? That is a tangible, um, like that is a way to do good in your community that is just so different when you think about fundamental value systems than knowing who the mayor is and or showing up to a meeting or even just generally being aware. And I feel like one of the things I took away from your books most strongly was just the importance of journalists being less judgy about people's relationship to information and less sure that our way of doing it and what feels right to us and to our social networks is the right way. And so the issue you're raising of like not having sort of social pressure to be informed or social incentive to be informed, I think is really interesting. And it's my tendency is to be judgy about that. And I'm trying really hard to fight that tendency.
Yeah, I mean, we're the same. My co-authors and I, we are people who study journalism and for a living and do personally believe in its value. But we really tried to enter this whole subject by trying to put ourselves in the shoes of the people that we were interviewing and really understand the world from their perspective. When you do that, it's pretty reasonable, and you can sort of understand why people are making the judgments about this stuff that they are in a way that really made us reflect a lot on like why we choose to consume as much news as we do.
Mm-hmm. Can you say more about that question of how news makes people feel? That was another theme in the book, is that news is just, it's bad for me personally. It might be bad for society.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this was one of the things that came out right away when we started doing the first round of interviews. A lot of people talked about how some of them talked about, it's not news, it's me. And they talked about being very anxious people to begin with, really worried all the time. And they found like news was just sort of exacerbating some of those tendencies in them. And so they felt like for their own mental health, they needed to screen it out. Um, But there were others who really put they saw the problem as news itself, and they would point to, the sensationalism and the kind of, the world's on fire feeling that they got for every time they paid attention. And at some point they felt like, this isn't really helping my sense of the things that are actually important in my life. I'm better off kind of having a more distant relationship with it. And I think that, this all, I should say too, like all the interviews we were doing were before the world shut down with COVID-19. And so that sense of like how depressing news could be or how anxiety filling it could be, that just became what we were hearing in those interviews just started to resonate more and more. And I think that's one of the reasons why the interest subject has really taken off, is I think we all recognize how news can have that impact on us. Even, and these were people who were talking about this during the years prior to that.
Also, people don't differentiate between different types of news as much as journalists wish that they did. And so when they are saying news is, it's all fake, or it's all skewed or biased, or it makes people more polarized, or all of that is true in some cases. We could all find examples of where we think news causes harm or fuels distrust in each other, or fuels polarization more than curiosity and empathy. That's something we've studied a lot and worked on a lot at Trusting News and coach newsrooms through, understanding how your news is going to resonate with people who see the world really differently, and just being more aware of that. And so that question, you talk to people who were not differentiating between more polarizing cable news, for example, and what they might find in local news or more sort of mission-driven news. We can wish that they were differentiating and being more discerning, and talking not in generalities, but the fact is they're not doing that.
Yeah, and for most people who don't have a sort of habit around paying close attention to news, when you talk to them about journalism, the associations they tend to have, it differed from country to country, kind of what that dominant idea of what news is. But in the UK, people tended to focus a lot on the tabloid newspapers, The Sun and the Daily Mail. In the US, people, what they had in mind were cable news commentators. And they're the kind of most prominent examples. For many people, they've never talked to a journalist. They've never really thought about what it is that journalists do. And those are the kind of exemplars that people are thinking about when it comes to news. And the truth is too, like people, they would say they might be more interested in local news, but they often felt like they didn't even know where to turn for that. And so there is that aspect of this that's also going on, that kind of the nature of the information environment has really changed, where the kind of most dominant sources of information that people have in mind are maybe not the things that are most appealing to them, and they don't quite know where to turn to for the other stuff. And that's a sort of larger challenge. I mean, we in the book, we've kind of divided up the main themes that we focus on in terms of what we call identity, ideology, and infrastructures. Some of this has to do with the infrastructures piece, the pathways that people are accessing to find and discover and engage with news are really different today than they were 30 years ago. And that is something that is also driving this sense of how sort of when people would come into contact with news and what that experience is like.
Yeah. So let's talk about what journalists can do about all of this. Let's get hopeful, shall we?
Yes.
And we'll tell you more at the end of the session about a way that Trusting News is inviting newsrooms to apply for a program. We're going to help folks work their way through some strategies that we all have a lot to learn about what works, but we definitely have some ideas about things we've been teaching and researching for years that we think can help. So we'll tell you more about that at the end of the session. But I have some buckets of strategies journalists might try, and I would love to get your thoughts on it, Ben. So the first question, I'm fascinated by what you learned talking to all of these people about their personal experiences with news, and your growing understanding about kind of normal ways people interact with news and how news does and doesn't serve them. And I'd like to talk about how journalists could kind of investigate this with their own audiences, especially on a local level. What can it look like, and why would it be worth the effort, worth the time to spend time really understanding people in your own community who are avoiding the news?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's I think it's where there's a lot of promise here. I think as like it's just a starting point. I think journalists tend to they're all, I mean, I'm married to a journalist. I know lots of journalists. I know how overworked journalists are, and sort of focus on deadline to deadline in terms of how your time is structured. But making space, however it's possible, to have these conversations where you're not just out trying to get a quote to, file your story, but to really try to listen to where people are and how they're thinking about the value of this information, rather than it always being driven by, I'm writing a story on X and I need somebody to fill in this missing piece of it. Because for a lot of the time, what people are expressing is a sort of frustration about, they're not seeing news that's relevant to the things that they care about. Now, some of the time that news does exist, but they're also not knowing, they're not, it's not reaching them. It's not being delivered in a form that is, that works for the way that they're living their lives. Many of them are, working full time, raising small kids. Maybe they're taking care of an aging parent. They've got like busy, complicated, difficult things going on in their lives, and uh, some of them may want to find time to pay attention to news, but they're not looking for sort of, hour-long, nuanced, in-depth treatment of every issue. They just want to know like the basic facts, to be able to get on with their lives. And they're having a hard time figuring out like, where do I turn to for that? Because one of the things that's become very clear is like, if you once you have a very disengaged relationship with news, it then makes it harder to know like, why should I trust that source versus that source? And a lot of people are just feeling like, well, it's I'm safer, smarter to disconnect from it all, and tune it all out. And ultimately, it doesn't feel like it's that important to the things I really care about. Um, and so I think that's the starting point. It's just basically trying to make time to understand where people are coming from, to be able to write or publish or broadcast for that audience, not just the ones you're most likely to hear from, who tend to be, people who have either love you or they have a lot of hostility towards the sort of, very idea of what it is that journalists are doing. There's much more of the public who are just sort of indifferent and struggling to figure out where it fits into their lives.
There are more people who are indifferent than hostile.
Yeah, that's something, and that's something that we really, struck us in the Trusted News project, even more so than in the News Avoidance project, where we were sort of very specifically focusing on this smaller segment of the public. But when we kind of zoom out and look at trusted news more generally, I think that the same is true there. That there is actually, a lot more of the public who are in that indifferent category, which is, I don't know if it's either reassuring or it's scary in its own right, because it is a signal of a kind of breakdown of the relationship between journalism and the public, but it's maybe one that where there's opportunity to change that.
I think so. And I think that fact really hit me as I was reading the book, because I think that journalists are often focused on the wrong problem. We at Trusting News, we go into newsrooms and try to help them assess who they're not reaching, who feels that journalism is not serving them well, or who is angry about journalism, and try to rebuild those relationships. And it seems like journalists have the sense that they have fans. I think we just get very binary about it. Like, we have fans of journalism, and then we have the people who hate us and are yelling at us in the comment section and are never, probably don't believe in facts and are never going to believe us no matter what we do. And it's really easy, I think, to give outsized attention there. But the disengaged middle, as the More in Common research shows us, like, there are a lot of people who just have very casual relationships to news. And I think you're right that there's more potential there to build habits, to build relationships, to try to build products that serve the needs of people we're not reaching. That is a totally separate problem than focusing on the people who are, antagonistic about the facts we're reporting.
I think that's true. It's also, creates a different set of challenges, because it is, as you were alluding to there, it's partly it's only so much of it is tied to the actual like content of the journalism, because if people aren't even going to have the opportunity to see that or engage with that, because they've sort of structured their lives in a way that they hardly ever come in contact with it, that's a different challenge to even sort of get on those people's radar screens. And there are a couple of people who actually changed over the course of our study, where we interviewed them initially and then we went back to them several months later, and most people's habits hadn't really changed, but a few people had, and that was really interesting. You know, window into the fact that it's possible that people just because somebody is a news avoider this moment in their lives doesn't necessarily mean that they'll stay that way. But also the factors that really did seem to matter for those people was partly about finding a form of news that really fit the way that they live their lives. Like one guy we interviewed had installed, or he started subscribing to satellite radio in his car, and because he drove around a lot for work, and he found like, oh, that's actually over time he actually really liked it. Or another woman we interviewed who got turned on to a particular podcast that her sister had recommended to her, and she found like that she also was driving around a lot. She had young kids, and so it kind of fit the way that she lived her life in a way that, not that these things didn't exist previously, but they hadn't really felt like there was a form of news that could work for them. And then the other part of it was that social community. And I alluded to both of those examples were people who that what the reason that really they changed their habits had to do with their friends and neighbors and coworkers who sort of created that added push. And so finding ways to kind of cultivate those news communities, I think it's really hard. I don't want to, I'm not under no illusions about that, but it's I think to me that's where there's real potential to create sort of sustainable change in that way. And that's a different sort of thing than like tweaking the content of the news, which I think tends to be what journalists think about first.
Yeah, I'll write my lead differently, and that's what's going to make the difference.
Right.
Yeah. So speaking of the sort of infrastructure and social network piece of it, I'm interested in the idea that like news finds people, and how so many people feel like they don't need to seek out news because it'll find them. It's on TV at the gym, a friend will mention it, it'll show up in their Facebook feed or whatever. And I'm interested in the question of like, I'm involved in some research with the Oklahoma Media Center, and they were talking to people in small towns around Oklahoma, and so many people did not really understand the difference between finding something out from a neighbor or finding something out from a stakeholder in an issue versus finding something out from a journalist. The basic question of how journalism, the value of journalism, how it's different from other types of communication, that seems like there's a gap in understanding across the country, across community size, that like the people don't really understand what journalists really do, and they don't really understand what they might be missing if they're learning about something from an interested party or from someone who may have a different relationship to facts and might just be passing on what they heard. Or can you talk about that, just that question of like explaining what journalism does and why it matters?
Yeah, I mean, we know in general people's sense of what journalists do is really low. There's just very, and it makes sense because why would, most people have never spoken to a journalist. I think in surveys it's something like 10 to 15% of Americans say they've ever actually had a conversation with a journalist. And these are often people who don't know any journalists. And so the idea of what this profession is comes from TV and movies, or what they're hearing from maybe political leaders that they trust, or anybody else. It's sort of a received wisdom. We call them folk theories. And they're the other thing is they are seeing, if they're on social media platforms, they're seeing just this like flood of things that look like journalism, just information sources, that is very hard to differentiate between like what's different about this versus a report from the New York Times. And there's a tendency too, I think people feel like so many of the times when they go looking for information on a search engine, they're seeing 15 versions of the same story, because well, we can talk about why, but that's what people feel like is they're mostly just seeing, their sense of it is journalists are just copying each other and reporting the same thing, and there's no real underlying reporting happening, or news gathering happening. So
which is not wrong in so many cases, right?
Right. And so, but they're sort of applying that in general, and belief that like, and there are lots of people saying like, well, they're just making stuff up. And so it's not hard to understand from that perspective, like why people would have a hard time seeing any kind of unique value of independent, rigorous journalism, because their sense is that it doesn't go on. And so I think that's one of the challenges here, is I think needing to kind of make that case as a profession, what that value is, in a way that I think often journalists and news organizations sort of take for granted that the public kind of will see the value of this work if we just do a better job with our reporting, that people will see and value it. And no other industry that is this like has this low standing with the public has this attitude that like, well, they'll just come to appreciate what we do if we just continue what we're doing. That's not working. Like you have to actually make a really strong affirmative case at like an industry level for what the value is that is distinct from all the other sources of information people are seeing, because that information is circulating so easily in these environments. It's actually putting the actual original reporting at a disadvantage.
Well, another piece of that is something you mentioned earlier about we were talking about how people equate news with politics, and the value of journalism is much broader than that. So when people click through in their Facebook feed to like a graphic and explanation about the new traffic pattern at the new interstate exchange that's being built, they're not really using that to judge journalism. They're just like taking in information, right? Or when they're reading about when a new restaurant opens. I feel like journalists do a really bad job explaining the breadth of what we offer, the value of what we offer in general. And we allow people to we make it way too easy for people to have a very narrow conception of what it is we do.
Yeah, and I think it's also this goes back to the infrastructures piece. There's a lot of the things that people once valued about journalism that wasn't really about the journalism that has now been replaced by other more efficient tools. So, there's a very famous old study from 1948 called "What Missing the Newspaper Means," where Bernard Berelson interviewed people during a newspaper strike in New York City about their experience of no longer having a newspaper because of the strike and what they missed about it. And most of the things that people were talking about that they missed were, the sports scores or the society pages or just like the habits around it that weren't even about the information. And those pieces, like, first of all, the habits have totally changed. But then, like, if you want to know what the weather is, you want to know what the latest restaurant openings are, you want to know sports, like, there's many other ways to get that information much more quickly and efficiently. Where I think for a lot of people, they're having a hard time seeing why should I pay for this other packaged content when like the stuff I most care about I can get for free elsewhere. And that's a bigger existential challenge for journalism. But at the very least, you have to sort of recognize that like if people don't see the value in the journalism, it's not, you can't sort of like guilt them into seeing it. Like you have to sort of meet them where they are and recognize like they're looking for some actual value that fits their lives, and you have to sort of make that case because it's not obvious to most well, to a large segments of the public.
Yeah, and show up to that conversation with some humility, because if there is a Facebook page where they can find out up to the minute what restaurants are opening and closing, then why would they pay you for that? Make sure that that it's accurate to say that you offer unique value that's worth paying for.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, how about on an individual level for a news organization? It feels like it would be really helpful to talk more about what specific value we offer that's different from kind of acknowledging the media ecosystem is a mess. It's confusing. It's hard to know what to trust. It's hard to know where to turn for this. Here's what we do, and here's what we offer. Here are the values that drive our work. Here's what you can count on us for. Here's how we want to be an antidote to that. Here's what we do differently than other people. Can you talk about that, what it would look like? Recognizing, of course, that if you do this, you have to first have people's attention before it makes any difference. But how would it be helpful for journalists? What would it be helpful for journalists to share about their approach, and would any of that be persuasive?
I think it could definitely be. I think there is some curiosity, particularly at the local level, because people have such a disconnection from journalism. Like I talked to um, I mean, one woman I talked to in the UK, when I asked like what she thought about journalists, she asked me like to clarify, are those the people that write the news stories? I mean, the level of understanding about this entire profession is so minimal that I think there are opportunities there to engage just out of pure curiosity. Because there's another news reporter I talked to in Iowa who he talked about basically when he wanted to know information, he felt like he had to go out and interview people himself. And he gave a story about doing this, and then realized like, yeah, in a different life, maybe he would have actually enjoyed being a journalist himself. I do think like there are ways in which people are kind of hungry for a sense that there is something distinct about this profession that is actually providing something of value. So, if you can get people's attention and create space to have those conversations, I think there is real opportunity there. And I think people want to know, like, what are the kind of motivating there's a ingrained assumption that there's some sort of agenda that these organizations or journalists have driving some of these things. And I think, you know, letting people into the process in a way, I think is helpfully reassuring to people that isn't always the case, that the people do have. The other thing I'll say is like people will often talk about wishing there were places they could turn. Um, Somebody talked about how they wish there was a place they could go just to get the like basic facts of what had happened on news stories, where they had a sense that like this has been vetted, this is just the black and white, these are the facts. And as he was talking about this, I was thinking like, well, this sounds a lot like what a news organization does, but he that was sort of off limits in his mind as a possibility. And so it's not that people don't aren't are incapable of seeing the potential value there. It's I think they have a hard time um, seeing an individual news organization that they don't know much about, and that they have some skepticism that any organization can be impartial as the answer here. And I think I've sort of internalized the sense that like, no, the smarter way to be is to be distrusting of everything, to do your own research, to look at like 15 different versions of every story before you can feel like you have faith in it. And so that's actually not reasonable. And so most people's attitude is, well, I'll just throw my hands and ignore it because I'm not going to spend that kind of time.
And in reality, if they did try to look up using some of the language they used, just the facts, impartial, that's not language that journalists use. And most journalists aren't doing a good job of explaining, here's why you can trust us.
Yeah, yeah.
So there's one other thing I want to talk about, and then we're going to get to questions. I want to talk about the products and the amount of detail that journalists include in the context, and sort of this idea we began with of different types of audiences. How do you serve the people who are like, hey, I hear there's drama in Congress, versus the people who are like, how many times has the House voted today? And do we have a new speaker yet? I'm interested in the idea of creating sort of 101 level products. How do you, I worked with the Texas Tribune years ago on a newsletter called Teach Me How to Texas, that was like, kind of civic literacy and like, just, it was designed to be sort of an easy entry point. Like, here's how public life in Texas functions. And I don't see a lot of other products like that. And I'm wondering what you would love to see, what questions you would love to see journalists asking as they think about how accessible their journalism is to people who are not already engaged.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what's tricky is like a lot of people will say that they're looking for this, but they're also the least likely to be paying attention to news. So like I think one of the reasons there isn't more of this is when it gets created, there isn't a lot of engagement with it. And so I think news organizations feel like, is this really worth their time and effort? But I do think that is one of the areas where there's a real need where to sort of try to engage this news avoiding audience who has the indifferent audience who might have some potential interest down the line, but feel like the level of time and attention it would require to make sense of what these ongoing news stories are is so hard that it just feels easier to tune it all out. I think they are looking for kind of ways of engaging that are meeting them where they are in terms of their current understanding of these political systems or the figures that are in the news, or what the Speaker of the House does, or even I talked to a guy in Iowa who you'd think in Iowa everyone knows what the Iowa caucus is, but he asked me to explain what it was. He lived in Iowa his whole life because he was that disconnected from it. And it's not that news organizations don't create these kinds of products, but I think they're often not easy to find, and they're particularly for an audience that's already not sort of engaging with the organization itself.
I suspect, I know that when I talk to journalists about things like this, one of the things they worry about is sort of dumbing down the news.
Yeah, yeah.
Like, are we trying to write this for third graders? What are we doing here?
Yeah, and I do think this is, I mean, I hope with these new technologies that are, everyone is talking about AI in journalism these days. And I do think that there's a real potential there for these kinds of tools to help repackage the same information to better serve different kinds of audiences that are ultimately are looking for different kinds of information. I think there is a danger if you're of presenting news in a way that might seem like you're dumbing it down to be able to reach this audience, that then your highly, super engaged audience is going to feel like, what is this? I want the, more sophisticated version of the story that I'm interested in. And that is one of the challenges, is like they're serving lots of different people who are coming from different perspectives in terms of their starting point for engaging with this information.
Mhm.
But I do think, often the ways journalists think about making their journalism more appealing and better is often the ways that journalists themselves would be interested in stories that are like more nuanced and more in depth and more detail, and sort of treating every issue with if every different perspective you could add. And I think like I appreciate that journalism too, but for a lot of the news avoiding audience, that's not what they're looking for. They're looking for something that's kind of closer to really good quality, local TV news that gives them the basic information they need to move on with their lives, but isn't something they have to spend, more than a few minutes a day to feel like they're getting what they need out of it. And that's real value for people who have other things going on in their lives that news isn't, top of the list.
Yeah. All right. Let's take some questions. Molly and Lynn, how should we do that?
Yeah, so the first question that came up, Ben and Joy, is one about just this idea of when people are avoiding the news, or from what you learned, Ben, from your research, does it matter if it's national or local news? So like, did you see a difference in the number of people who maybe talked about their avoidance of national news compared to local? Are there any trends that you see there? And then I guess the other kind of follow-up to that you may or may not know is, does access to local news impact whether or not someone is avoiding news more or less?
I'll take the second part of it first, because I think that one is, I do think that there's something there. I mean, the access question, we can think about it in a couple different ways. I mean, some of the news avoiders did talk about the costs involved in, paying for not just their subscription, which they might have had when they were, younger and their parents were paying for it, but also in terms of like, there was one guy I talked to who canceled having his cable bill because it was too expensive, and then he felt like he was cut off from television news, but he didn't really mind it. So there is something about access, and then there's also like the sources of news that are available to people at the local level. Increasingly, the what they're actually feeling like they could get for that, for paying for that product is diminishing, and so and in some cases there aren't really sources of local news that people can turn to at all, and so that I think that access there is relevant. But I think there's larger issue on the sort of demand side, that even if it was there and it was accessible, our starting point for the whole study was we live in a world in which news information is so abundant, so accessible, more so than ever before, and yet there is this sizable portion of the public who are not consuming any of it, and so there is, I think, big demand side factor that's going on here beyond just a question of access. Um, in terms of the local versus national distinction, this came up much more in the U.S. than in Spain or in the U.K., where there is a feature of the U.S. media market that there's much more of a history of strong local news. But I will say, often people felt like when they were thinking about news, they were thinking about national news, and local news just didn't figure into their lives hardly at all. Occasionally they had some sense of like where they might turn to for the local news, and definitely would say like they were much more interested in local issues, and could see the value and the relevance of that in their lives, but not necessarily insofar as going out and looking for it. And I think part of this is about the national news sources are so much more visible in people's daily lives, like whether on media on social media platforms or on TV, it's kind of present in a way that it's harder to ignore, and so there's sort of more likely to come in contact with it. Whereas a lot of these local news sources are increasingly kind of more and more distant from people, and obviously struggling in many cases, and so they have a harder time um, reaching these audiences altogether.
There's another great question. So you guys shared a lot of good ideas of kind of what journalists can do, but Matt asked if you had a sense of which type of news avoiders, like what types of people might be most easily brought back into the fold.
I think, we kind of the way that we were defining this broad category of people, just news in general, that they were accessing less often than once a month or never. Within that category, there's a lot of variation, and so there are some for whom they do have some people in their lives who pay attention to news, that they may have once been people who consume more news, but at this moment in their lives it doesn't fit in. Uh, and I think that there are those individuals, like the couple that I talked about before, whose habits changed over the course of several months. I think there are people who are kind of in that category who probably would have eventually found their way back to being news consumers because of the people that they did know and or the professions that they had, that kind of created an opportunity for it. But they had sort of that extra push by changing their habits. I think within that too, there are a set of people who they're tuning out news altogether, but there may be kind of niche areas of news that they're much more interested in. So there was one guy I talked to in the UK who said that he was absolutely obsessed with Manchester United soccer, and he said he consumed so much information about the team, mostly on Twitter, that he felt like he had no time to pay attention to any other forms of news. But obviously, he pays a lot of attention to news of one sort, and so there was kind of an entry point for him to engage with news. And I think there are others for whom that is kind of a similar thing, where people have specific interests, where a news organization can maybe meet them in serving those needs and something that they do really care about. That might be a way of kind of creating that relationship that might lead to other kinds of forms of engagement down the line. I mean, if you look at the success that the New York Times has had in terms of building its subscribership base, it's around like word games and cooking and Wirecutter, like these other tools that are serving real needs that people care about. They tend to be things that its existing audiences, are maybe predisposed to be into these kinds of things. But there's definitely lots of non kind of in the weeds political news that are more likely to be things that you kind of find a favorable reception among the public for, that I think are opportunities to kind of build that relationship, that I think trust and engagement will flow from there.
Then kind of building off of that, is there anything in the research that came up specifically, maybe a mention, you kind of mentioned some topics that people were interested in, but any brands that people specifically mentioned or organizations, whether that they are not avoiding or that they are avoiding, and why? And I love how when this question was asked, Allison, that you also referred to it and said information, because I think that's important too. Like, did anyone talk about where they're getting information? And so Allison's wondering, like libraries, public schools, community groups.
Yeah, that's something, we were very deliberate in the way that we structured our interviews, but we actually were asking people about information in general, not necessarily about news, because we were kind of curious about the larger picture of how people were staying informed. And many people did have kind of a person in their life that is sort of a social proxy for news that they could turn to keep them up on at least like the big stories, or would alert them to anything important, what they thought was important. And that's really an important, that I think ties into the sense of there being embedded in a news community, whether news is kind of part of that or not. But those kind of individual relationships can be pretty meaningful. Now, some of those individual relationships were kind of reinforcing people's sense that like, no, paying attention to news is not something I want. Like they would talk about like colleagues who just thought about politics all the time. That's what they associate with people who pay attention to news. And so I think it can cut both ways. But those kind of and they were, I would say too, that they tended to be kind of idiosyncratic in this way. Like they tended not to see um, libraries or other resources as places they could turn to for that. But that's not to say that those aren't real possibilities. Some people would say they would rather, if they were looking for information on some subject, they would rather go to like find the official sources from their local government, or a like local Facebook group rather than news. And again, I think it's partly not only seeing the kind of negatives that they associate with news, not the value of the independent journalism that is underlying it, because the assumption is, well, journalists must be making stuff up or they have some agenda. But they were interested in kind of other sources when they felt like they had something to add, something that they could get from when there were, the occasions in which they felt like they needed to find some information out that they couldn't on their own.
Ben, thank you. We're just about out of time, but this has been so wonderful. Thank you so much for taking time to share with us the highlights of what you learned and also what you want to learn. There's so much still to know about this. We have ideas, we have hypotheses. So thank you for giving us so much to do and so much to think about. I'm going to stop here and say that since we started Trusting News in 2016, one of our goals has been to bridge sort of the fields of academic research and practice. And we're always thrilled when researchers like Ben are so practical in nature and willing to do research in a way that is actionable for the industry. And that is a sweet spot for us at Trusting News. So we have often over the years run cohorts of newsrooms to try things that we think will help. And then we share back what we're all learning together. We learn in public, collaborative learning. So Molly's sticking a link into the chat for a cohort we're accepting applications for now to build on some of the things Ben and his colleagues learned and would like for us to test. So in this initial news avoidance cohort, we're going to be designing an interview guide for people to go talk to people in their community who are not already engaged with news, specifically to learn more about that. And we're going to work on what journalists want to get on the record about their own approach. How do we take what we hear from the community and craft language that could actually be persuasive or meaningful? There's a lot more we want to do after that. That's what we're gonna tackle in this first cohort. So the application deadline for that is end of day Monday. And please let us know if you have any questions. A couple other links you're probably finding in the chat. At Trusting News, we have a weekly newsletter called Trust Tips that shares one quick actionable tip for earning trust every Tuesday. We'd love for you to subscribe. We also have a series of trust kits on our website that walk people through some of our most foundational strategies. So with that, thank you for coming. Thank you for your time and attention. And Ben, thank you so much.